Hello, my name is Laura DeMarco, and I'm the author of Mark Twain's America Then and Now. Thank you so much for spending the evening with us, and especially thank you to the Center for Mark Twain Studies for the invitation to speak as part of this season's Trouble Begins series. It's truly an honor, and a bit intimidating. Mark Twain is a tough act to follow as a speaker, to say the least. Tonight we are going to take a journey, and what better time with so much of us just re-emerging into the world after a year of lockdown. As Samuel Clemens wrote in 1869 in The Innocents Abroad, travel is fatal to prejudice, bigotry, and narrow-mindedness, and many of our people need it sorely on these accounts. I think we can all agree that is more true today than ever. Clemens also said in an 1867 letter to his mother, "I am wild with impatience to move, move, move." This is a sentiment we all likely share now. But few Americans traveled or moved as much as Samuel Clemens, known to the world as Mark Twain. At the time of this letter, this man who was to become one of America's greatest writers was about to embark on his first international voyage, the Quaker City cruise to the Holy Land. He already had two great adventures behind him, working as a steamboat pilot on the Mississippi and roughing it across the wild, wild West. Little did he know, this man so wild to move, that he was just in the early stages of his biggest adventure, a lifelong journey to reinvent American literature while making Mark Twain the most famous pen name in the world. The Quaker City cruise was just the next stop. For my 2019 book, I followed along with Twain on his life's journey as I researched close to 70 locations. It was my third book. My first two focused on the city of Cleveland, which surprisingly figures rather prominently in Samuel Clemens' life. I'll be talking about that more later on in our travels. Sam Clemens was a journey that took him across small towns and big cities, the Middle East and Midwest, the North and South, Hawaii and Europe, and most of the United States. It was also a journey that took him, like his famous creation Huck Finn, from small-town antebellum Southern boy with all the prejudices that implied to one of the most enlightened thinkers of his era. In my research, I traced Samuel Clemens or Mark Twain's journey through major stops with more than 200 pictures to tell the tale. His biography is told chronologically against the backdrop of the places where he lived and visited, from a one-room cabin in rural Missouri to a sprawling mansion in Connecticut. Of course, we can't visit all of these tonight, so for this audience, I will focus more on the lesser-known sites, although Hannibal and Elmira will certainly make appearances. Along the way, we'll travel from tiny Florida, Missouri, through the river towns of the Mississippi, to the Wild West in the heyday of the gold rush, to San Francisco and the East Coast literary scenes. And that's before Mark Twain even published a book. But why? Why retell the biography of a man known so well to most Americans, from scholars to school kids? Because to no writer has a sense of place been so important. Not one place, like Hawthorne or Faulkner or Cheever, but many places. Places that define the growing, rapidly changing America and the American abroad. Samuel Clemens began life as a Southerner, found his calling in the West, and died a Yankee. Mark Twain's travels and growth reflected a changing America and were inspired by America. So telling Clemens' biography through the places that informed his life is only fitting. Each place we will visit tonight is only a brief snapshot of a man with a very full and often tragic life, but they give a really very full flavor of Mark Twain. Each locale features photos of the places around the time that his life journey took them there. The thens are close to what the great writer would have seen. The nows bring the book and Mark Twain's legacy into the present. Pairing historic images with modern-day viewpoints of the same location from the same perspective reveals how many of the sites important to Mark Twain are with us today and how many are not. It also reveals how his legacy continues to influence so much of American culture. Sources are listed at the end of the lecture, including the Library of Congress, newspaper archives, and historical societies. Are you ready to take a trip? Because as Mark Twain once said, broad, wholesome, charitable views of men and things cannot be acquired by vegetating in one little corner of the earth all one's lifetime. Thank you. Our journey begins in Florida, Missouri. While much of America heralded the streak of Halley's Comet overhead in 1835, this tiny village near the Salt River in Monroe County, 120 miles from St. Louis, welcomed a cosmic arrival of another sort on November 30th. Samuel Langhorne Clemens entered the world 2 months premature, the sixth of 7 children born to Jane and John Marshall Clemens. He was so small and weak he wasn't even expected to live. Even his mother saw, quote, little promise in him. Little did they know that this sickly baby would become one of the most important voices in American literature. Years later, Mark Twain himself would suggest his birth into a, quote, nearly invisible village was momentous, saying, "The village contained 100 people and I increased the population by 1%. It is more than many of the best men in history could have done for a town." The Clemens moved there from Tennessee while Jane was pregnant in 1835 to be near her sister, Patsy Quarles. They originally lived on the outskirts of town, but soon bought property and built the cabin where Sam was born. Just 48 miles from the Mississippi, residents hoped that Florida could become a regional shipping hub. Those residents included Marshall Clemens, who formed the Salt River Navigation Company to sell bonds for construction to encourage river commerce. But fluctuating water levels made this impossible, and by 1839, Jane and Marshall and children left in search of better fortune in nearby Hannibal. It wasn't the last Florida saw of young Sam, though. He continued to spend summer vacations on his Uncle John Quarles' farm. It was here that the young boy had his first knowledge of slavery. He became friendly with a man named Uncle Dan, emancipated by John Quarles in 1855, who was an inspiration for Jim and Huckleberry Finn. Fate was not kind to Florida after its most famous resident left. By the time of Clemens' 1910 death, the population had doubled to 200, its high point. 100 years later, however, Florida was a ghost town. That white cabin where its most famous resident was born lives on, though, at the Mark Twain Birthplace State Historic Site near Missouri's Mark Twain State Park, where it was moved inside a museum building that includes a reading room and several of Twain's first editions. It was listed on the National Register of Historic Places in 1969. John Marshall Clemens was a quintessential American type, in search of the American dream, pursuing it across towns and careers big and small in this vast land of opportunity. He took his family along for the ride. Tonight, we're joining them. When his river venture didn't work out in Florida, the Clemens headed north to the larger town of Hannibal, right on the Mississippi. Marshall sold his Florida acreage for a 9,000 square foot city block in the middle of Hannibal. 90 miles north of St. Louis on the Mississippi, Hannibal predates its most famous resident's arrival by just 20 years. It became part of the United States in the 1803 Louisiana Purchase and was surveyed in 1819. Prior to that, it had been home to Native American tribes, including the Chickasaw. By the time the Clemens relocated to Hannibal, it was Missouri's third largest city. Logging, a limestone quarry, hog farming, and meatpacking were some of its main industries. The river hub was fertile ground for John Marshall Clemens' ventures, which ranged from running a general store to establishing the Hannibal and St. Joseph Railroad. He also served as a steamboat commissioner. Though Marshall's business ventures were never very successful, he became a justice of the peace and was a prominent figure in town. Today, industry has largely fled Hannibal, but his favorite son has become big business and made the city into a major tourism destination. Hannibal, now home to 17,000 people, is a hotspot for travelers from around the world who are seeking to experience an iconic American small town. Mark Twain and Hannibal's glory days live on at the Mark Twain Boyhood Home and Museum Complex, which not only includes the Boyhood Home, but also Marshall Clemens' office and a museum. Though the house and office and riverboats are much unchanged since the Clemens time, one wonders what Mark Twain would think of breweries, cafes, coffee shops, and even a water park opened in his name. By 1839, 8 Clemens were residents of the growing river town of Hannibal, including 1-year-old Henry. The family's first residence was a hotel near the river called the Virginia House. But in 1844, the most significant move of 9-year-old Samuel Clemens' life took place. The family moved to the now legendary Boyhood Home, a 2-story white wood frame house near the general store at 206 Hill Street. This simple house would prove far more than a home. It was here that Clemens found the inspiration for his stories of young boys in small-town America that would define his career, including that famous whitewashed fence. His father's law office, across from the street at 205 Hill Street, also provided inspiration for the inquisitive young son. Afraid to return home one late night, he snuck into his father's office to sleep, only to literally stumble upon a dead body awaiting investigation by the judge. This was just one of many Hannibal adventures and misadventures that stuck in the mind of the writer-to-be. The late 1840s were not easy for the Clemens family, however. They lost their house at one point, and tragically, Marshall died from pneumonia in 1847. That same year, Sam would witness a man shot to death on the street and come across the mutilated body of an escaped slave on the Mississippi. This was the end of Samuel Clemens' innocent boyhood, though he would remain in Hannibal for several more years. Those carefree days of hiding in caves and playing by the river were overtaken by work and the concerns of the adult world, until decades later when he revived his childhood upon the page. Today, the Boyhood Home still stands, a legacy to its great importance not only in Mark Twain's life, but in American literature. Restored in 1990, it's one of 9 properties that make up the Mark Twain Boyhood Home and Museum complex in Hannibal. Samuel Clemens would visit this home one last time in May of 1902, a spontaneous side trip on a journey to accept an honorary degree at Columbia, Missouri. Now 66 years old, Sam must have been feeling nostalgic when he decided to visit the place that not only spawned him, but also Huck and Tom and Jim and Becky. He had not been there for 12 years. He arrived May 29 on a train from St. Louis with a reporter from the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. By that time, Hannibal was a humming industrial town of 18,000 with more than 100 factories. While there, Sam Clemens visited Mount Olivet Cemetery. His childhood friend Laura Hawkins toured the town and paid his respects to the Boyhood Home. "It all seems so small to me," he mused when he arrived in front. "I suppose if I should come back here 10 years from now, it would be the size of a birdhouse." By age 18, the city of Hannibal could no longer contain young Sam Clemens. With 2 years of newspaper experience behind him, he decided to do something about it in 1853. On May 25th, he placed an ad in the Journal for his replacement and set out for St. Louis, the first stop on his lifelong journey. He chose St. Louis because his sister, Pamela, had recently moved there with her husband, William Moffett. At the time, St. Louis was a major American city of more than 100,000 residents. The small-town boy was wonderstruck. "The first time I ever saw St. Louis, I could have bought it for $6 million, and it was the mistake of my life that I did not do it," he said later in Life on the Mississippi. Despite his awe, Clemens didn't stay long in the bustling city. He sought work as a journeyman printer, securing a position at the Evening News. It only lasted a few months. His first glimpse of a big city had opened his eyes to the world beyond Missouri. Soon, Samuel Clemens was on the road again. Meanwhile, the big city on the river continued its rise to prominence. Stalled by a Union blockade during the Civil War, the post-war years were a boom time for the city at the intersection of the North and South and gateway to the West. It was a town with ambitions much like Sam's own, and a town he visited many times in his life, as did his characters. As Huck notes in The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, "The 5th night we passed in St. Louis, and it was like the whole world lit up." The next few years were filled with adventure for young Sam Clemens as his wanderlust grew as he traveled from St. Louis to New York and Philadelphia, through the nation's capital, back closer to home to Keokuk, Iowa, where Orion was living. In 1856, he found himself in Cincinnati, Ohio, of all places, where he planned to earn money for a trip to the Amazon. That fall, according to his autobiography, he claimed to have found a $50 bill on the sidewalk in Keokuk and planned to go to South America with his newfound wealth. Clemens left Cincinnati for good in February of 1857, heading south towards New Orleans on the Paul Jones riverboat. It was a journey that would change his life forever. When Clemens set out for New Orleans, he had Brazil in mind as his ultimate destination. The Crescent City was just a way stop on his way south. He would later recall in Life on the Mississippi, "It was only about 1,500 miles from Cincinnati to New Orleans, where I could doubtless get a ship. I had $30 left. I would go and complete the exploration of the Amazon. This was all the thought I gave to the subject." He spent his days taking in the sights as the boat headed south. "When we presently got underway and went poking on the broad Ohio, I became a new being and the subject of my own admiration," he would write. "I was a traveler." Along the journey, he became friendly with one of the pilots, Horace Bixby, and sadly learned that when he made it to New Orleans, his journey to the Amazon would not be as easy as he thought. There were no boats expected for more than a year. But that didn't matter so much anymore. Clemens had begun to have new ideas about his future as early as Louisville. By the time the Paul Jones pulled into the parish of New Orleans, Brazil was no longer in the picture. Bixby had agreed to take him on as an apprentice. Enter Samuel Clemens, cub pilot. The years after that fateful trip were some of the best of Samuel Clemens' life. The boy from Hannibal was living the dream of so many adventurous young men of the time, learning the steamboat trade. From 1857 to 1861, his life was one big trip on the Mississippi, back and forth from New Orleans to St. Louis to Memphis, Vicksburg, Baton Rouge, Cairo, Illinois, and other river cities. Of all of the cities Clemens experienced in his riverboat days, however, New Orleans held a special attraction for the young man from Missouri. No surprise, really. This exotic, multicultural city was a world away from Hannibal. At the time of Twain's visits, the Crescent City was experiencing rapid growth as European immigrants from Germany, Italy, and Ireland flooded in, joining the French, Creole, and African residents. The city had the largest population of free persons of color in the South. At the time, New Orleans had a population of 190,000, up more than 40% from a decade earlier. It was the third largest port in America. But it was New Orleans' vibrant French culture that most intrigued the 21-year-old. While in the city, he stayed at the Pilot Association rooms. When not working, he spent his days wandering the French Quarter, especially enjoying the market. He wrote to friend Ann Taylor, "I thought I had seen all kinds of markets before, but that was a great mistake." He raved about the pyramids of fresh exotic fruits, lobsters, oysters, cakes, coffee, teas, and nuts. Not to mention, quote, Lord knows how many more different kinds of people. But nothing intrigued the small-town boy than Mardi Gras, which he experienced in 1859. It was one of many remarkable visits Sam paid to New Orleans in those days. Perhaps not as memorable as his visit in 1861, however. He was in New Orleans when Fort Sumter was attacked and the Civil War began April 12th. A few weeks later, on May 14th, he set out aboard the Nebraska. His journey was short. South of St. Louis, the ship was stopped by a Union blockade, ending Samuel Clemens' 4-year idyll on the river. Looking back, the most problematic chapter of Samuel Clemens' life to consider is his time in the Civil War, or lack thereof. Though later thought of as an enlightened Yankee, Clemens was a born Southerner. Like many of his statesmen, his sympathies were not clear. Following his experience at the blockade outside of St. Louis, Clemens eventually made his way back home to Hannibal. He was conflicted about his next step. Then, one night, a knock came on the door. It was some townsmen recruiting for a group of Confederate irregulars, the Marion Rangers. The gang made Sam its second lieutenant. Though Hannibal was filled with Union soldiers, the Rangers never saw battle. After a few weeks of playing war, Sam was convinced a soldier's life was not for him. But with the war raging in the East, what could be next for this man, equal parts Northerner and Southerner? He decided to head west. Orion had recently been appointed Secretary of the Nevada Territory by President Lincoln, whom he had campaigned for in 1860. His brother decided to join him. The two left St. Louis on a steamboat headed to the town of St. Joseph in July of 1861. This stagecoach stop of just more than 100 residents was headquarters for the Pony Express. With money saved from his steamboat days, Sam paid $300 for 2 tickets on Pike's Peak Express Company. On July 25th, the brothers departed for Nevada. A new chapter was beginning for Samuel Clemens, much of which would later be recalled in Roughing It. The brothers arrived at their intended destination, Carson City, the capital of Nevada Territory, on August 14, 1861. Orion got to work, but Sam was bored. He logged, he mined, and eventually Samuel Clemens struck gold, literary gold, in the town of Virginia City, Nevada. It was here that he got his first professional writing job as a reporter for the Territorial Enterprise. Located in one of the fastest-growing cities in the West, thanks to the Comstock Lode, the city grew from 2,000 in 1860 to 7,000 in 1870. The Daily Enterprise was one of the most respected newspapers in the region. It had a robust staff, headed up by owner Joe Goodman. The writers covered the news and culture of the day in their unique Western vernacular. Goodman encouraged this wildcat type of reporting. Clemens loved his new job, both the work and the hard-living culture of the profession in the frontier town. Like many of his colleagues, his nights were almost as busy as his days, mingling with the miners and actors in saloons and pool halls into the wee hours. Then he'd be back at work in the morning, pounding the streets in search of news. There was plenty to be found. What had been a tiny backwater a few years earlier was quickly growing into a rich city. As more and more people arrived in search of treasure, Virginia City boomed. Clemens enjoyed it all from his front-seat view of the new American dream. He was hired to write straight news, but what he ended up covering was far more interesting. Editor Joe Goodman emboldened writers to take risks, and Sam was one of the riskiest, no surprise. He soon veered from news to outrageously colorful profiles and columns about people and places in town that were often more satire than reportage. Clemens had found his voice and his calling. It wasn't long until he found his name, too. In early 1863, the Star reporter took leave of Virginia City to return to Orion in Carson City. By this time, Orion's wife Molly had moved west, and they had a daughter, Jenny, who would tragically die of meningitis in 1864. Sam sent back several humorous letters to Goodman to publish in the Enterprise, one of which began, quote, "I feel very much as if I had just awakened out of a long sleep," dated February 3rd, 1863. It was signed Mark Twain. A new era had begun with the creation of the most famous pen name in American literature. Drawn from his old riverboat days, the phrase referred to a depth of 12 feet, the point where the water becomes safe, or, in the other direction, dangerous for ships. It was fitting for the new voice that Sam had been trying out for the Enterprise. He was sharp, acerbic, sarcastic, often irreverent, always insightful, and sometimes truthful as Mark Twain, which could prove a problem while writing for a newspaper. In October of 1863, it proved very problematic indeed. In the most outrageous hoax of his career, Twain penned a story headlined, "A Bloody Massacre Near Carson." Said to be the story of a man who lost a fortune and then massacred his family, the satire was lost on just about everybody. Adding to the damage, papers in other cities picked it up, spreading the false story. When Enterprise readers found out it was a hoax, they were outraged. Many canceled their subscriptions. Twain offered to quit, but Joe Goodman kept him on. Bad or good, Mark Twain was making a name for himself. Mark Twain was born in February of 1863 in Virginia City. A year later, he had moved on. Sam Clemens was growing bored of the small frontier town, and he was discouraged at the Enterprise. So he hit the road again. This time he headed further west to the largest, most cosmopolitan city on the West Coast, San Francisco, our next stop. Claimed by the United States in 1846 and the Mexican-American War. The city had been inundated with 49ers in the gold rush. Between 1848 and 49, the population grew from 1,000 to 25,000. But it wasn't just fortune seekers and sailors. San Francisco also had a large population of bankers, Chinese railway workers, Spanish and French residents, and a newly wealthy upper class. It was into this international stew of gold diggers, nouveau riche, scrappy prospectors, and dreamers that Clemens moved in the summer of 1864. By then, the city was heading towards 100,000 residents. Clemens loved the city's energy and possibility. He soon had a job at the San Francisco Morning Call. A paper aimed mostly at working-class immigrants, it was the city's largest morning paper, with a circulation of 10,750. The Call was a much more serious paper than the Enterprise, however, and he proved a poor fit. He was a byline-less reporter on a small staff pounding the streets 12 to 13 hours a day, covering crimes, courts, theater, and just about everything else. When he tried to editorialize about racism against a Chinese washerman, though, it was spiked. Just 4 months after he started, Sam Clemens was fired from his first big city newspaper job. The Call lived on for many years after dismissing America's most famous writer, however, even after its building was destroyed in the earthquake of 1906. It was purchased by William Randolph Hearst in 1913 and renamed the San Francisco Call-Post. It was eventually purchased by the San Francisco Examiner and closed in 1965. Following the loss of his morning call job, Clemens remained in San Francisco for a while, making money sending stories to the California Literary Journal. But then, as now, San Francisco was an expensive place to live. He was soon on the road again, this time with friend Steve Gillis. Gillis was on the lam from a potential manslaughter charge for a barroom brawl. Eventually, Clemens decided to join Gillis's brother Jim on a trek to his cabin on Jackass Hill, 7 miles northwest of the mining town of Angels Camp. Jim and another brother, Billy, were miners, and they taught Clemens how to prospect for gold. But it was a different kind of fortune he struck in January of 1865. Bored with cabin life, Steve and Sam headed down to Angels Camp one night for a drink or two at the Angels Hotel. Opened in 1851 as a quick wooden structure, the hotel had been greatly expanded by the time they visited. It was a large affair with a second floor with 14 rooms and a 2-story porch. Its cozy bar was a popular watering hole for local miners. It was in this bar one dreary January night that Clemens heard a story that would change his life, a story about a frog, the celebrated jumping frog of Calaveras County, to be precise. It was a story that had been told many times before he heard it from bartender Ross Kuhn. He may have even heard it before, but never the way that Kuhn told it. Clemens couldn't get it out of his mind and began jotting down his own version in his notebook. A month later, he received a note from an old friend, Artemis Ward, who was seeking stories for an upcoming book. He decided to submit The Frog Tale, but missed the deadline. Still, Ward submitted it to the New York Saturday Press under the name Mark Twain. It was published as Jim Smiley and His Jumping Frog. The tale from Angels Camp was a hit, reprinted across the country. Sam eventually rewrote it as the celebrated jumping frog of Calaveras County for the Californian. It became so popular that it jump-started Mark Twain's career. Today, a plaque noting the importance of that story told in that bar all those long years ago stands in front of Angels Hotel, which is now an apartment building. Here, Samuel Clemens first heard the yarn that was to bring him fame as Mark Twain, it reads. Soon, Mark Twain was on the road again, and the ship. The next few years found him capitalizing on the literary fame the Jumping Frog had brought, as well as making more of a name thanks to an 1866 trip to the Sandwich Islands for the Sacramento Union. That trip eventually led to Mark Twain's auspicious speaking debut in San Francisco. That success, in turn, led to Clemens' entree to the East Coast speaking circuit, which led, in 1867, to the journey of a lifetime when Clemens made a fortuitous visit to a church, of all places, the Plymouth Congregational Church in Brooklyn. Built in 1850 on Orange Street, under the guidance of the Reverend Henry Ward Beecher, the church was founded by transplanted New Englanders. It was a center of the abolitionist movement and supportive of women's suffrage. At the time that Beecher was the pastor, he was even more famous than Mark Twain. Mutual friends recommended Sam visit the Reverend when he made it to New York, and it was one of the first things he did. He took away two things from his visit to that church: a respect for the Reverend and information on a trip to the Holy Land that the congregation was planning. The group would embark on the retired naval vessel, the Quaker City, for a 163-day voyage to the Holy Land, the Black Sea, and Mediterranean. Sam was intrigued. As a former steamboat pilot, taking a journey on this enormous paddle wheel steamer was enticing. He loved the water and travel, but he couldn't afford just to sail off, so he secured a deal to send dispatches to the Alta California. When the ship set sail, the Reverend was not on board, but 8 physicians were, 70 congregants, 3 clergymen, and 1 irascible writer. Sam Clemens threw himself into shipboard activities, but soon he found a group of card-playing, drinking sinners he would rather hang out with than most of the church congregants. On land, the divide between Mark Twain and the Pilgrims was just as apparent as they ventured across the Holy Land. While these earnest Americans threw themselves into the grand tour, the writer took in things from a more of an intellectual distance. Though he loved the exotic, Mark Twain was a man of the New World, not old, and this was very apparent in his reports. His aesthetic is perfectly summed up in this take on Rome. What is there in Rome for me to see that others have not seen before? What is there for me to touch that others have not touched? What is there for me to feel, to learn, to hear, to know, that shall not thrill me before it pass to others? What can I discover? Nothing. Nothing whatsoever. One charm of travel dies here. Clemens began sending his dispatches back to the Alta almost as soon as he departed, but there was a problem and most of them didn't make it through. Soon, however, he had another idea. He would write a book, and not just any book. The Innocents Abroad would turn out to be the best-selling book of Mark Twain's lifetime, and it featured perhaps his most famous line about travel. The gentle reader will never know what a consummate ass he can be until he goes abroad. I speak now, of course, in the supposition that the gentle reader has not been abroad, and therefore is not already a consummate ass. If the case be otherwise, I beg his pardon, and extend to him the cordial hand of fellowship, and call him brother. Samuel Clemens didn't just come away from his boat tour with a new book and career in mind. He also came away with his future wife in mind, Olivia Livy Langdon. On board the Quaker City, Clemens had met a young man from a prominent family in Elmira, New York, named Charlie Langdon. The two young, adventurous travelers bonded. But it wasn't just Charlie Langdon in whom Sam was interested. The writer had caught a glimpse of a miniature portrait of his sister, Olivia, and was smitten. The two met briefly in New York City, but didn't spend much time together until the writer visited Livy's hometown in the summer of 1868. Which brings us to our next stop, a very familiar one, Elmira. Located about 230 miles northwest of Manhattan on the Pennsylvania border, Elmira was a well-heeled and busy transportation hub of 16,000 residents at the time. It was located between New York City, Rochester, Buffalo, and Albany. It was a major route for transporting coal from Pennsylvania mines on both railroads and canals. The Langdons were a wealthy family who had built an enormous Victorian home on North Main and West Church Streets. Father Jervis had made his fortune in the coal industry. He was so successful that at his death in 1870 he left a fortune of over $1 million. Before he visited, though, Sam had to stop to make in Hartford to see Elijah Bliss. Work was coming along well on his book, tentatively titled The New Pilgrim's Progress. That done, Clemens set out for the destination in his heart. The writer arrived at the Langdons' genteel household on August 21st. He called the Langdons the, quote, pleasantest family I ever knew in a letter to his mother after he arrived. Sam and his host spent their days in conversation and exploring Elmira. He used his natural storytelling ability to keep the family entertained. It's unlikely Sam and Livy spent much time alone on that visit. Their brief acquaintance did not stop the passionate scribe from making a bold move. However, he proposed, and she declined. However, Livy did tell Sam he could write to her as, quote, brother and sister. He took her up on the offer. His first visit to Elmira did not go as planned, but Samuel Clemens was not deterred. Whether he knew it or not, Livy and her hometown were to become a big part of his future. As for the Langdon house, its fate was not as bright as the budding relationship. It was eventually bequeathed to Livy's niece in 1934. There was talk of turning it into a museum, but no funding, and it was razed for a strip mall in 1939. The name is Langdon Plaza. Our next visit is to a place that is near and dear to my heart, Cleveland, Ohio. Samuel Clemens had left Elmira with work to do on both his book and budding relationship. This brought him to, of all places, Cleveland. My hometown would prove transformative to the young writer and would-be lover. Why Cleveland? Well, while on the Quaker City, Sam had befriended a wealthy society matron named Mary Mason Fairbanks. Though she was only 7 years older than him, he dubbed her Mother Fairbanks. She was the wife of the co-owner of the Cleveland Herald, Abel. She was a college-educated woman, mother of two, and a writer herself. The Herald was Cleveland's second paper and first daily newspaper. It had begun in 1819. Its offices were located on Bank Street, West 6th, and Superior, in what is now the trendy warehouse district. Sadly, it was torn down decades ago and is now a parking lot. Just 1 year later, the Herald would figure prominently in Sam's life when he made a bid to purchase it from the owner, Abel. Alas, he didn't have enough money and he had to pursue other career paths. Mother Fairbanks was more than just a wealthy wife, however. Sam called her the most refined, intelligent, and cultivated lady on the ship. He trusted her so much he had her read some of his dispatches that he was sending to the Alta California. He also would turn to her, as a society lady, for advice about his relationship. This was to be a friendship that would last a lifetime, 32 years. Her influence on him was extensive, especially in the early years of their relationship. This wasn't just a social visit. Clemens had decided to throw himself full force into his new speaking career. He had lined up an extensive speaking tour of 26 states that would begin in Cleveland. He arrived there in early September, with little more than 2 months to prepare for the ambitious lecture tour through the Midwest and East Coast. Alas, he had not yet even formally decided what the tour would be about. He had been giving a lecture called Pilgrim Life, being a sketch of his notorious voyage to Europe, Palestine, and etc. earlier that year, but wasn't sure if he wanted to do the same. With the Quaker City voyage still so much on his mind, it obviously emerged as the theme, but he decided to rewrite it. The new talk would be titled The American Vandal Abroad. With his book slated for an early 1869 release, it was a great way to promote it, too. Mother Fairbanks agreed, in theory. The refined society lady thought he should rein in his more sarcastic tendencies that were likely to offend the audience and herself. In retrospect, it's clear she provided a beneficial service, toning down Clemens' baser instincts and impetuousness, leading to a leaner, funnier, and more benevolent talk. Clemens allowed her to read it and edit his draft several times as he worked in the Fairbanks St. Clair Avenue house. He also allowed her to throw him a reception in his honor, introducing him to Cleveland society as a, quote, reformed prodigy. Clemens would deliver the speech in Cleveland on November 17th at Case Hall, a 1,200-seat Victorian Italianate lecture hall built in 1867 on Superior Avenue, not far from the Herald. In 1875, City Hall would open right next door. Eventually, this building was demolished along with the old City Hall in 1916. Today, the Cleveland Public Library stands on its site, as does the Metzenbaum Courthouse. Mark Twain would be keeping some heady company at this venue. Other speakers to have graced Case Hall included Horace Greeley and Henry Ward Beecher. He was paid $100 for the night. There was a lot of pressure on the rising star to live up to expectations. He met them. The day Samuel Clemens had been dreaming of finally arrived on February 2nd, 1870, the day of his marriage to Olivia Langdon. Though Livy had agreed to become his fiancée in November of 1868, it had taken 17 months of courtship for the big day to arrive. That included many months of planning a way to make a living that would please his soon-to-be in-laws, after his plan to buy the Cleveland Herald fell through. Fortunately, Jervis Langdon had a plan, in the form of $12,500, which he used to help Sam buy into the Buffalo Express. On March 15th, he became managing editor. Finally, in front of 75 guests in the parlor of the Langdons' enormous 3-story home in Elmira, all those long months seemed worth it. The Reverend Thomas K. Beecher, brother to Henry Ward, and Sam's friend, the Reverend Joseph Twitchell of Hartford, jointly performed the Congregationalist ceremony. Boned turkey and no liquor was served at the reception, which was also held at the Langdon house. Sam and Livy set off for their new hometown the day after the wedding, February 3rd, 1870. Sam had already been living there since he had taken his position at the newspaper in August. The newlyweds were accompanied on their journey to the city by Livy's parents, as well as several members of the wedding party. Buffalo would become the Clemens home for the next 2 years, the longest that Sam had stood still in a very long time. These would prove to be transformative years, both personally and professionally. When the couple first arrived in the city, Clemens thought the carriage drivers were lost when they headed away from Swan Street, where he had been living. He soon realized that he had been the victim of a, quote, first-class swindle, a very generous one, by his new father-in-law, Jervis Langdon. Langdon had bought the couple a new home at 472 Delaware Street, one of the city's finest addresses. This was no starter home either. It was a mansion, fully furnished with a cook, maid, coachman, stables, and even a horse with a monogrammed carriage. The second Empire-style house had been built just 5 years earlier. At the time, this was one of the most exclusive addresses in Buffalo, which was a busy city of 118,000 with a large grain industry thanks to its location on the Ohio and Erie canals in Lake Erie. The newlyweds were very happy in their new city at first. They became popular members of society thanks to Livy's wealth and Clemens' status at the Republican-leaning paper. It has been said that Clemens hung a sign by the door proclaiming, "Mark Twain lives here and my father-in-law pays the rent." No evidence of this exists today. However, no evidence exists of the house either, which was demolished in 1963 after being chopped up into offices and falling victim to fire. Cleveland was the beginning of an extraordinarily successful speaking tour for Mark Twain in 1868 to 1869. This success, in turn, was followed in 1869 by the success of his first book, The Innocents Abroad, which became the best-selling book in Mark Twain's lifetime. It sold more than 70,000 copies in his first year alone, making him something of a rock star in post-Civil War America. When the Atlantic Monthly, the most prestigious publication in 19th century America, took notice, the literati began to pay attention to this man from Missouri, too. To Clemens' great surprise, the monthly weighed in with a very positive review. This humorous travelogue was far from the usual topic of the Boston-based literary journal that was at the forefront of the progressive topics of the day. Being published in the monthly meant you were a serious American writer, usually a New Englander, too. Featuring this upstart from the South who had written a humorous book for a popular audience represented a seismic cultural shift. The review was written by one of the Atlantic's youngest staff, an assistant editor named William Dean Howells. His lengthy, wide-ranging review touched on everything from the shams of travel to the role of irony in writing to the role of the American in the world. It included this paragraph that would echo throughout popular American literature. Quote, "Under his nom de plume of Mark Twain, Mr. Clemens is well known to the very large world of newspaper readers, and this book ought to secure him something better than the uncertain standing of a popular favorite. It is no business of ours to fix his rank among the humorists California has given us, though we think he is, in an entirely different way from all the others, quite worthy of the company of the best." Clemens was so pleased with this review that on his second trip to Boston in November of 1869, he made a point to visit the Atlantic office, which was then at 124 Tremont Street, but had operated out of the Old Corner Bookstore on Washington Street until 1865. Today, sadly, this spot where the great minds of the day, such as Emerson, Hawthorne, and Thoreau, had met is now a Chipotle. I would be remiss to not mention the next major stop in Samuel Clemens' life, Quarry Farm. It wasn't his own home, but no place was more important in the writing career of Mark Twain than Quarry Farm outside Elmira. For close to 2 decades, Sam and Livy and their growing family visited her sister, Susan Langdon Crane, and her husband Theodore here each summer. But it was the 1874 extension of an octagonal study on a hill 200 yards from the main house that was its most important addition. It was here in this private study that Mark Twain would do significant writing on the defining works of his career, including The Adventures of Tom Sawyer and The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. The study was a surprise when Sam and Livy arrived that May. Sam raved about it in a letter to Joe Twitchell in that June. Quote, "Susie Crane has built the loveliest study for me you ever saw. It is octagonal with a peaked roof, each octagon filled with a spacious window, and it sits perched in complete isolation on top of an elevation that commands leagues of valley and city and retreating ranges of distant hills," he wrote. It was the perfect getaway from the world for the writer. Today, as you know, it is preserved as part of the Center for Mark Twain Studies on the Elmira campus. Mark Twain entered Buffalo a journalist. He left it a writer. The decision to leave the city in 1871 wasn't difficult. Life had been hard after those first few happy months of marriage. The troubles got worse after Jervis Langdon died. Sam and Livy's first child and only son, Langdon Clemens, was born prematurely and was very sickly as well. The house at 472 Delaware Street was no longer a happy one. Sam had also grown tired of working at the Buffalo Express. In July of that year, he signed a contract for a second book with Elijah Bliss for what would become Roughing It. He began working on this and was bored with the newspaper job. Troubled at home, unsatisfied with journalism, he sold the paper in early 1871. But not just the paper. The day after it sold, the Clemens put her father's grand gift on the market for $25,000. It was time to move on. And so they did on March 18th of that year, heading for Livy's childhood home in Elmira. This was just a temporary stop for Livy to convalesce, however, and for Sam to write. Their ultimate destination was Nook Farm, an artist colony outside of Hartford, Connecticut. It dated back to 1853, when two prominent and progressive citizens, Francis Gillette and his brother-in-law John Hooker, bought up farmland and sold lots in the area to their friends and family. The Clemens wanted to be closer to Hartford, where Elisha Bliss lived, and to this bustling, creative community. Their chance came in August. John and Isabella Hooker, friends of Livy's parents, offered to rent the young family their Nook Farm house while on a European vacation for $300 for 4 months. The Clemens were elated with the chance to move closer to the literary action of Nook Farm, especially into such an impressive house. They moved in on October 3rd. Their new neighbors included Harriet Beecher Stowe, Charles Dudley Warner, and many spiritualists, feminists, activists, and other progressives. This was not to be their permanent home in Hartford, however. The growing Clemens family needed their own home, a home befitting a writer of prominence such as Mark Twain, someone who was never afraid to flaunt or spend his wealth. In spring of 1873, Sam and Livy began to make plans. They bought a lot for $10,000 on Farmington Avenue, paid for with royalties from Roughing It. It was a dream come true for this poor country boy born in a one-room in Florida, Missouri. He was about to move into one of the most exclusive areas in the country, with money made from writing, of all things. The couple hired New York architect Edward Tuckerman Potter, known for designing Tudor Revival churches. The Clemens had nothing as sedate as a church in mind, however. What Livy had sketched and Potter would expand upon would come to be known as one of the most unique houses in American history, a sprawling 3-story high Victorian Gothic with a steeply pitched roof and asymmetrical bay windows. Many thought the house resembled a riverboat, though the Clemens never confirmed this. It was to have 19 rooms and 5 baths, with flushing toilets, too. The family moved in on September 21st, 1874. The house was like nothing Nook Farm had seen, but then again, this was no ordinary family. They were rich, creative, and free-spirited, and this house reflected that. Soon, Sam was hard at work on his next major book in his study on the top floor, The Adventures of Tom Sawyer. This billiard room was made for men only. Creative and personally, the move to Farmington Avenue was the beginning of the happiest decade of Samuel Clemens' life. In the 1880s, the family would later expand upon the house. They had never been completely happy with the interior, so when the money began to come in from The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, they decided to redecorate. And not just any renovation. Mark Twain, critic of the Gilded Age, wanted more opulence. He and Livy hired Louis Comfort Tiffany, the leader of the Art for Art's Sake aesthetic movement, to oversee the renovation. They paid Tiffany $5,000. New decorations included wallpaper, Middle Eastern-inspired stenciling, Indian-inspired paintwork, and several Tiffany windows, which disappeared after the family sold the house in 1903. Other design elements borrowed from Morocco, Japan, China, and Turkey. After the Boyhood Home, this was to become one of the 2 places that most defined and impacted Mark Twain's personal and professional life. Today, the Farmington Avenue house is a fully restored museum dedicated to the author. Elijah Bliss had died in October of 1880, and Clemens agreed to sign with Boston's James R. Osgood. At the time of Bliss's death, The Prince and the Pauper was nearly completed. Osgood stepped in to publish the book in 1881 in a deal far more favorable than Bliss's terms. Reviews were quite positive. But Sam had bigger ideas at work than this mostly children's book dedicated to his daughters. It was time to go back down the Mississippi. He and Osgood signed a contract in which they would be partners, allowing Sam Clemens a much bigger share of the profits in exchange for paying for much of the publication himself. Osgood would also travel with Clemens on his journey through his younger days. The two left for St. Louis on April 17, 1882. Along for the ride was a teacher from Hartford named Roswell Phelps. They would be gone for a month on their sojourn. The plan was to revisit the places that had formed Sam Clemens in his pilot days: St. Louis, New Orleans, Memphis, Vicksburg, and of course Hannibal. The first half of the book would consist of his Atlantic Monthly essays, written as if in real time during Sam's 20s. As he described how he learned the ropes from Horace Bixby, however, Clemens comes across far more naive in print than he ever was in real life. The second half would be an older man's return to the places of his youth, discovering how they and he had changed. That includes this passage about Vicksburg, the Mississippi city at the top of the bluff where the Yazoo and Mississippi rivers meet. It was the last Confederate stronghold and was under siege for 47 days before falling to U.S. Grant and his Army of the Tennessee in 1863. Quote, "We used to plow past the lofty hill city, Vicksburg, downstream, but we cannot do that now. A cutoff has made a country town of it. Signs and scars still remain as reminders of Vicksburg's tremendous war experiences. Could you, who did not experience it, come nearer to reproducing it to the imagination of another non-participant than could a Vicksburger who did experience it? It seems impossible." In his later years, New York City would become home to Samuel Clemens, who had several residences in the city, including West 10th Street and Riverdale. But beyond his homes, several other locations in the city figured prominently in the great writer's life, including the Players Club, Delmonico's, and Charles L. Webster Publishing House. Perhaps most interesting was the workshop of inventor Nikola Tesla on Fifth Avenue. Clemens' interest in this was understandable. He was fascinated with technology, though not blindly so, as a Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court reveals. His embrace of the potential of the page typesetter was an example of this. Clemens' passion for these progressive inventions and the men who made them made sense too. He was a modern man, reinventing American literature. Thomas Edison's phonograph ended up making a cameo in his book, but it was Edison's greatest competitor, Serbian emigre Nikola Tesla, with whom Clemens became close friends. The two men met in the early 1890s, though Tesla was familiar with Mark Twain books from his childhood. Sam knew of Tesla for the alternating current he had invented for Westinghouse. By 1894, he was a frequent visitor at Tesla's laboratory at 33 to 35 Fifth Avenue in New York. It was here that Tesla worked on his groundbreaking experiments in alternating current, wireless electricity, remote control, radio waves, and X-rays. Clemens believed Tesla's alternating current would, quote, revolutionize the whole electric business of the world. Though Tesla was outshone by Edison in their era, today Clemens' view has seen as prophetic as Tesla's visionary ideas have been reevaluated by the scientific world. Sadly, his lab burned down in 1895, destroying years of work and research notes. By 1895, H. Rogers had helped the Clemens sort out their finances. It wasn't pleasant. They were $94,000 in debt, and Clemens was a man who paid off his debts. He was 59 years old, tired, depressed, and suffering from gout. His mother and Livy's mother had died, and the children were grown, although still living at home. Most depressing of all, to save money, the family had had to close up their beloved Hartford house on Farmington Avenue in 1891. Despite all this, Clemens came up with a plan to repay his debts. He would return to the road, with Livy and Clara along for company. Late in middle age, he was revisiting the art form that made him famous as a young man. An ambitious international speaking tour of Australia, New Zealand, India, and Africa was planned. But first, Mark Twain would begin on familiar territory, very familiar territory. He kicked off his world-speaking tour on July 15th at the Music Hall in Cleveland, a city that had served him well in launching his 1868 tour. Opening night will be followed by 140 other dates and would take over more than a year. The title was billed as Mark Twain Reading and Talking. Overseas, it was called Mark Twain at Home. The subject would be morals, or lack thereof. The show was announced in the Cleveland Plain Dealer on July 7th. The Fairbanks had long ago left the city, so he couldn't count on them for rave reviews anymore. Since the Fairbanks were gone, he stayed at the new Stillman Hotel on Erie Street while he prepared. Music Hall, opened a decade earlier in Bond and Erie Streets, was the town's largest gathering place, a steep, foreboding building that could seat 4,000. It burned down just 3 years later. Sam needn't have worried about the press, raved the Plain Dealer, quote, his immense shock of hair has turned nearly white, but his humor is just as vigorous and his style as entertaining as ever. Once again, Cleveland had helped launch Mark Twain on a tour worth taking note of. For a man who spent so much of his life roaming, home was of the utmost importance to Samuel Clemens. The Boyhood Home in Hannibal was the source of so much Mark Twain literature. The home on Farmington Avenue, with its heart and sullen eyes, was so much more than a place to live. When the family was forced to leave America due to their financial troubles, it was a source of great distress. Finding a new home in New York after their return from Europe brought some order and joy back to their life. So it was with great care in 1906 that Samuel Clemens decided to build what would be the last place he would call home. In March of that year, he purchased 195 acres outside of Reading, Connecticut, near where Albert Bigelow Paine lived. He would later add on more acres. Clemens hired famed New York architect John Mead Howells, who would go on to design the Tribune Tower in Chicago, to create a Tuscan villa inspired by the time he had spent in Italy. His favorite room would include a nod to his long-gone past, a hand-carved fireplace mantel from Hawaii. At the time, the land was known as Birch Spray Hill, but Clemens wanted to name it himself. Possibilities included The Innocents at Home, but his daughter, Clara, convinced him to name it after a short story he had written, Captain Stormfield's Visit to Heaven. The name would be Stormfield. Construction took nearly 2 years. Finally, on June 18th of 1908, he was met at the West Reading station by Paine and his daughter Louise to see the final construction. He was greeted by fans bearing flowers and setting off fireworks. Sam was very pleased, as he told the New York Times, "It is the most out-of-the-world and peaceful and tranquil and in every way satisfactory home I have had experience of in my life," he said. He was 72 years old at the time. Clemens soon returned to entertaining, inviting everybody from Helen Keller to H. Rogers to Ida Tarbell to his new home. Clemens had hoped his daughters would reunite with him at Stormfield, but Clara was on the road with a singing tour and Jean's epilepsy had worsened, and in 1908 she went to Germany in search of a cure. A little bit later, Clara would make news at Stormfield when on October 6, 1909, she married a Russian pianist there. Joe Twitchell officiated. In attendance were Jean, Sam, members of the Langdon family, and a few friends, just a total of 40 guests. Following their wedding, the couple left for New York and Berlin, where they lived while on a tour of Germany. This left just Jean and Sam in this big house, until tragically, on Christmas Eve, Jean, who had spent the day decorating, trying to recall some of those wonderful Hartford, Connecticut memories, died tragically in the bathtub of a seizure. Laid bare by his grief, Clemens composed an essay titled The Death of Jean that night. He gave it to Albert Bigelow Paine, saying, "Read it. I can form no opinion of it myself. If you think it worthy some day, at the proper time, it can end my autobiography. It is the final chapter." This was the last thing Mark Twain ever wrote. "It will be the greatest disappointment of my life if I don't go out with Halley's Comet. The Almighty has said, no doubt. Now here are these two unaccountable freaks. They came in together, they must go out together," proclaimed Samuel Clemens to Alfred Bigelow Paine in 1909. He wasn't to be disappointed. Clemens' health and morale plummeted after Jean's death on Christmas Eve, 1909. He took one last trip to Bermuda to see his old friend W.D. Howells, but was so weak that Paine had to fetch him, and they sailed for home April 12th. Paine, keeper of his legacy and constant companion to Samuel Clemens in his final days, was at his bedside as he faded, as was daughter Clara and nephew Jervis Langdon. Samuel Clemens embarked on his final journey April 21st, 1910, age 74. Mark Twain had once said, "A distinguished man should be as particular about his last words as he is about his last breath." But Clemens' last words were reportedly simple. "Throw away," referring to some unfinished manuscripts he handed to Paine. He also managed a goodbye to Clara. His funeral was held at the Brick Presbyterian Church on Fifth Avenue on April 23rd. His old friend Joe Twitchell led the prayers. Following the services, his body was taken by rail for the burial at Woodlawn Cemetery in Elmira, New York, next to his beloved Livy. His simple gravestone read, "Samuel Langhorne Clemens, Mark Twain, November 30th, 1835 to April 21st, 1910. Clara had a 2-fathom monument installed to honor her father's famous pen name." Overhead, Halley's Comet had come back into view on April 10th and was making its way through the atmosphere back to the heavens.